Hi, everybody. Welcome to Shasai Podcasts, conversations between scholars from around the world who study childhood, youth, and related institutions historically. As an official production of the Society for the History of Children and Youth, you can subscribe to these shows through iTunes or Google Play. Written and visual materials associated with each episode are available at our website, shcy.org. Enjoy.
Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for listening. My name is Cynthia Connolly. I'm a professor of nursing at the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing, and I'm associate director of the Barbara Bates Center for the Study of the History of Nursing, and I'm a pediatric nurse and a historian of children's health. And I'm talking today to my good friend, Janet Golden, and we're going to talk about my book that came out in 2018, published by Rutgers University Press, and the series for which Janet is one of the series editors, Critical Issues in Health and Medicine. And the book is called Children and Drug Safety, Balancing Risk and Protection in 20th Century America. Janet is a professor emerita at Rutgers Camden University Department of History. I think she's well known to many of the people who will be listening to this podcast, but I will turn it over to her and let her add anything she wants about herself and then start asking some questions.
Well, good afternoon, Cindy. I'm glad to see you virtually. In different times, we'd be together in the same room. I'm really excited to talk to you about your book because it crosses so many fields, from history of healthcare to children's history, pharmaceutical history, business history. It's really very exciting. So I just want to begin by asking you, what is it that you see yourself as studying as a historian?
That's a great question. So what I wanted to do was to do all those things that you mentioned. So as a pediatric nurse, I'm interested in historical topics that have some salience or resonance to contemporary issues. But I also want to do good history. And so I was looking for a topic that was a contemporary issue and still an issue, policy and practice issue, for which really you could only understand the issue by unpacking it historically. And so it would engage both sides of my brain. And so and that it sat at the interface of the state and business, as well as the history of healthcare and how we think about children and families in the United States. And that it would also add to the history of what we know about drugs and drug policy, what made it the perfect topic for me to spend 10 years on.
So let me just add that you cover so much ground in this book, and yes, I have read it twice. And when you went to sort of ask historical questions, what were the questions that were in your head to ask of the raw material? Sure.
Well, thanks for asking that. But in order to answer that question, I need to tell you exactly how I got interested in the topic. And it was in 2002 when I was working as a fellow on Capitol Hill in the office of the late, great Senator Paul Wellstone of Minnesota. And I was asked to staff a hearing in 2002 for proposed legislation that ultimately became landmark pieces of legislation, the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act and the Pediatric Research Equity Act. And I thought I knew something about children's health in the United States. Then I had been a pediatric nurse for more than 20 years. And I thought I knew something about the history of children's health care too, because I had just finished a dissertation on a pediatric related topic, and that was on children and tuberculosis. That became my first book. And so I heard then Senator Christopher Dodd of Connecticut made a statement that we needed these two pieces of legislation. And he said only a fraction of the drugs on the market had ever been tested for safety in children, and that we were routinely playing Russian roulette with our children. And I sat there absolutely stunned for the reasons I just said. I thought I knew something about children's health today and yesterday. And I'm looking around the room and all the policy people are nodding. And I'm thinking, I'd given hundreds of drugs at that point. I'd given hundreds of different types of drugs, probably to thousands of children. And I had used my drug manuals, and could look up the normal, what I thought were evidence-based doses. And I thought that we knew exactly what we were doing, that these drugs had been tested, and there was good evidence to support them. And most of the pediatricians I went and asked didn't know either, that we didn't have a sound basis for the clinical practice of children and pediatric drugs. And so here's what I knew, that most of the pieces of major 20th century drug-related legislation had come about because of issues surrounding children, from the founding of the FDA, in part because of these narcotic-laced syrups were being sold over the counter, killing thousands of children a year, to a major law in 1938 that came about because of one of the first sulfa drugs where hundreds of kids died, to the thalidomide disaster in the 1960s. All of these had involved children, and keeping children safe played a major role. And so how was it that we ended up making drugs safer for adults, but not children? So that's what framed the first question, is how did we get here, and why did we get here? Because it wasn't like no one was thinking about these issues, but nothing we tried seemed to work. And here we were in the 21st century. And go ahead, sorry.
Really, the main argument of your book is we have to know why we've been giving all these drugs to children, but we've not asked what the drugs do to children. Is that what you want to say?
So, not exactly. The main argument of the book is that despite the fact that we had evidence pretty early on that children, that with regard to drugs, children needed their own laws. I'm not saying children needed their own laws for everything. Children, benefit from the same pure water laws, pure air laws, excuse me, safe highways. But we developed, there was sturdy evidence early on that in order for children to be receive the drugs, these new drugs coming on the market that stood to really benefit them, they needed their own laws in which people were thinking about how to make sure that we have adequate data, pediatric data. But because we never asked because that was considered politically untenable, no one could figure out how to get industry to pay for that testing, or if industry should pay for that testing, or should government, should hospitals, who should pay. And the thought that probably there wasn't going to be political will to add new regulation on a very powerful and increasingly powerful in the 20th century sector of the American economy, people kept trying to come up with workarounds. And so that's my central argument, is that we kept avoiding the real questions because we thought there'd be no political will to do what we finally did in the 21st century.
Do you think is the contribution your book makes then to give us this history, or is it also to nudge us to pay even deeper attention to this issue? So
it's really both. It's to give us this history It's to use this history as a case study of despite the florid rhetoric all across the political spectrum about the ways in which the United States has always acted in children's best interests. At a peak moment, which I argue is the early 1960s, JFK is in the office. He has a young family. We just had the 1960 White House Conference on Children's Health, a landmark among all of those White House conferences. And it's sort of like the peak moment of the baby boom. And the United States has never been more powerful and never been more wealthy. And the evidence has never been more strong that the laws in place are not protecting children. We still do not do the right thing by them. It's to point that out, the difference between the rhetoric and the reality in the United States with regard to child protection and how we think about children. But it's also about the fact that, yes, these laws now are in place. However, a lot of the drugs we use in children came to the market before these laws were in place, and they're not about to be removed from the market, and we haven't done that testing. And how are we going to do that testing? Is that testing going to move offshore to other parts of the world where, for a health clinic that might get built in an impoverished part of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, we might ask a community to expose their children to testing drugs in ways that we won't expose American children to. So how do we think about children on a more global scale, and whose children are we thinking about when we think about child protection in the 21st century?
Oh, and I can't think of a more timely matter now that we have questions about pediatric COVID cases, about
Yes.
pediatric COVID treatments, about vaccines. And I know every week the American Academy of Pediatrics puts out a report on COVID in children, and every state has a different definition
Yes.
of the child. They're combining infants and 17-year-olds. Having read your book, that makes the point about we can't see children as some massive category where an infant is the same as a 17-year-old.
Right.
We continue to do that, and we continue to not collect the data we need, just the baseline data on illness or responses to treatment. So I don't know if you want to go and say something about that.
So I'll say that, yes, there was an article in JAMA Pediatrics in September 2020 that points out to the readership that of the 270 trials registered in clinicaltrials.gov in the United States, only 30 enrolled patients under the age of 18 years. And so while there is a lot of data that's accreting about what treatments, technologies, drugs are working with COVID, children are mostly excluded from those studies. Now, they are a small subset of the people who are getting very, very sick from COVID, but to my mind, that's no reason not to have the data that we need to treat those who are getting very ill, because the children who are getting very ill and are dying from COVID are much more likely to be children of color, to be children from vulnerable populations, to be from impoverished communities children whose parents don't have the luxury of Zoom, doing their work from Zoom, but must go to the front lines to be a hospital cafeteria worker or a city sanitation worker. And so for all those reasons, the children who are getting sick and who are dying are those most vulnerable children.
And I will point out, and I learned this from our friend and your student, Jason Chernaski, that the percentage of children with COVID who are Latinx and African-American and poor is the exact same percentage of children who were diagnosed with HIV, AIDS, contracted in utero, and that is 75% of the cases. So that is an important thing to think about as we begin to look for therapeutics and vaccines, and as we begin to track what are the long-term consequences of exposure.
Yes.
And whether it's a mild case or a serious case, what are the long-term consequences? So let me turn away from our contemporary dilemma and ask a question that follows on. I know that as we go looking for the COVID children today and the pharma and the therapeutics, we'll know where to go because those drug trials are reported and there's information. But when you went to ask questions about the early 20th century and children and pharmaceuticals, what kind of primary material did you go dig up and where did you find it?
Sure. Well, thanks. Well, so I was lucky enough to have a large grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that not only provided me with salary support, but lots of travel money. And so that meant that wherever I found potential sources, institutional records, physicians' records, organizational records, National Archives, FDA records, I would be able to travel to go and look at those records. And that is a real luxury. So I wasn't limited by that. But I did face a number of challenges in that, first of all, it's a big sprawling topic. Hundreds of drugs came on the market in the 20th century. How to narrow and boundary the topic to be able to provide both a synthesis as well as do fidelity to key moments and turning points. Importantly, how to tell a story in which the pharmaceutical industry is such a central actor without being able to get into their records. I did try. I contacted multiple drug companies that had developed a number of drugs for children. I never received any reply. As late as the 1990s, a number of the people who were doing work on pharmaceutical history were able to get some access to materials. Because they never replied, I can't tell you exactly why I didn't get access. My hypothesis is that if there was something from a positive PR standpoint, they had already milked it themselves, and the last thing they wanted was some historian pouring through and finding something that might not point them in the most positive light. In other words, their lawyers convinced them that there was absolutely nothing in it for them, financially or from a PR perspective. And, they were probably right about that. And so what I needed to do then was to, but fortunately, the pharmaceutical industry wrote lots of letters, submitted lots of applications to federal agencies. They needed to draw on pediatricians in academic pediatric practice and some in private practice, and they needed to partner with organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics, all of which did keep great records. And so you can find, you can find lots and lots of things about individual drugs and about actions and inactions of the pharmaceutical industry through all of those other sources. And I was also able, and then institutional records of nurses' work, doctors' work, as much as possible. The experience of children and families, very hard to capture because, of course, institutional records are capturing what the doctor thinks, what the nurse thinks, not what the child thinks. You've really got to intuit what a child thinks from how they interpret, or a parent thinks from how they interpret that. And you, of course, Janet, brought the existence of the Sydenham records from a pediatric infectious disease hospital in Baltimore to my attention, and you and I wrote an article with an undergraduate student, Ben Schneider, and that was published in the Bulletin of the History of Medicine. And I used some of those same material and more, though, of the sydenham data to be able to, for the chapters in my book that related to antibiotics. And so the clinical records were really invaluable to be able to unpack what was happening on the ground.
You know, you make an important point there for other historians of childhood, which is one of the challenges that we face when we do healthcare history is, of course, patient privacy records and requirements that may dip because there's federal law there about what can be opened, and as well as IRB, patient protection. So we have a particular mountain to climb when we do childhood history that's in the healthcare field. But at the same time, I think what your book shows us is that when we look that we spend a lot of time in children's history kind of looking at the ways children are treated as young adults or not young adults, or how they're treated as precious future citizens. But what your book really shows us is that we give a lot of rhetorical attention to that. Our children are our future. But when it comes to passing these laws, whether it's a patient safety cap or whether it's testing of new drugs, children are really not getting the attention and the concern and the protection that we'd like to think they have.
Well, thanks. And that gives me the opportunity, of course, to talk about my favorite chapter in the book, and that's my aspirin chapter. So I loved all the advertisements for the pharmaceutical industry are fun to look at. The industry for my chapters in the book on prescription drugs, the pharmaceutical industry could only in that era advertise generally. So in other words, Merck could take out an advertisement in Parents Magazine that showed happy children and always white children, girls playing with dolls, boys playing with trucks, and mothers in shirtwaist dresses sitting around talking about how much safer childhood was now that we had these modern drugs. But the over-the-counter drugs like aspirin, drugs for constipation, were a completely different animal, because those companies could advertise directly to parents. And that's when I guess you really see some of the most egregious maltreatment of what children and family needs, and of acting in children's best interest. And so for a lot of different reasons, the aspirin chapter is my favorite chapter. Children's aspirin, also known as candy aspirin, becomes to the market after World War II, just on the cusp of the baby boom. A brilliant, perfect timing for this small dose flavored, delicious drug to become available, and very quickly it's incredibly popular, almost immediately. It's advertised to mothers as a product tailored just for your child, and if you care about doing right by your child, you're going to listen to the doctors in the ads and the testimonials from the mothers in the ads, and you're going to purchase this product that's been tailored for your child. But what we see is that advertising works really, really well. Before World War II, only about 20% of the aspirin poisoning deaths in children are from the aspirin poisoning deaths are from children. Most of the others are from adults who overdose. Within a 4-year period of time of introducing children's aspirin, children comprise 80% of the deaths. They're a main reason behind the founding of the first poison control systems of the American Academy of Pediatrics focus on poison, and of the FDA, some concerned parent organizations and pediatricians trying to figure a way to get industry to make it harder for little hands to be able to get access to these drugs that they're advertising as candy, and also to standardize the doses, because there was no mandate for Bayer and Plough so for St. Joseph's and Bayer's Children's Aspirin, to make sure that one tablet contained the same amount of aspirin, and they didn't. So unless you were a parent who read very carefully, you could give one tablet of one company's drug and be giving twice the dosage. And it's here and in the despite many attempts by the FDA and concerned pediatricians and parents to be able to ask industry to standardize their tablet and to try and come up with a way to get to be able to get these to get the pills hard to open for a child but still able to be opened by an adult. And it's really not until the 1970s that happens. And in the meantime, the aspirin industry leaves a well-documented trail through legislative hearings, letters, and other documentation of doing just what the tobacco industry and the lead industry and other industries are doing. And that is obfuscating the science, attacking the people who are bringing the problem to the attention. In one audacious pharmaceutical representative advocate who testifies on Capitol Hill blames I call it the blame the toddler defense, blames children and toddlers themselves for overdosing on aspirin because they're Dennis the Menace type children or children who are known to the child psychiatrist. So I think it takes a lot to blame toddlers for their own behavior, and most people wouldn't go there. And so you really, like I said, they leave such a trail where you can really elegantly see that what happens to children's interests when they back up against one of the most powerful industries in the United States.
You know, I think we should leave it right there because that was an elegant statement about maybe a time in the past or not so distant past or not the past at all, when faith in science and in the regulation of science was not always leading to good policies because people turned away from the science and didn't take the protective steps that citizens needed. And we'll just say that happened in the case for a long time with the aspirin and may be continuing.
Well, thanks a lot for, first of all, Janet, for making the time to do this. And thanks to everyone who's taking the time to listen. Again, I'm at the University of Pennsylvania. If you want to engage in any further conversation, shoot me an email and we'll set up a Zoom call, since my guess is we won't be in person for a while. So were you gonna say anything else, Janet, or?
No, Cindy, give them your email. So.
Oh, okay. My email is CAC and then the numeral 1 at nursing, NURSING, nursing.upenn.edu. All right, I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you, everyone, so much.
Thank you for listening to Shusai Podcasts. You can find more materials and features from the Society for the History of Children and Youth online, shcy.org.